What's up guys, Alexander here. Today I want to go over a study with you more in depth. I made a short about this study, but it's actually a really long study, so just want to say right off the bat guys, hang in there, this is going to take a minute. It's really hot outside, I'm going to start sweating, but we're going to try to make it to the end. I'm going to try to condense this as much as possible. So, some quick background on research into attraction, dating, and relationship formation in general. Most research on physical attractiveness is going to be coming from rating pictures of people, rating photos, or of rating individuals within a speed dating kind of study. A speed dating study, if you don't know what that is, people sit down in a circle, men and women, and then they get to communicate one at a time, briefly, for about 5 minutes, and at the end they get to pick who they want to date. The individuals can be rated. You can see if people pick to date individuals that are more attractive, if they have this personality trait, if they have that personality trait. Great. So what this means is there's actually a lot of, well, I guess I should say actually there's a big gap in the research literature in that we see very little mate selection long term. We see who gets rated as attractive. Speed dating studies are good because we see who might actually get picked for a second date. Some of these speed daters actually get to go on dates with these people after the studies. But very rarely do we have follow-ups to see who forms relationships long term and why. And is that related to physical attractiveness? Is it related to personality or behavior? And all of these variables that people say that matters, this matters more, etc., etc. So that's what this study does, and it's one of the first of its kind. It may actually be the first of its kind in that it tracks a medium-sized sample, young men, guys, this is relevant to you in particular if you are a young man, over time into the future, and it looks at a lot of variables. It looks at a few hundred variables, both individual difference variables and partner variables, to see which of these predict long-term romantic interest, which of these predict relationship formation. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on the methodology, but I do want to tell you a little bit of background about this study. If I go into too much detail, it's going to take way too long. I expect this to take a long time already. But the authors of this study are Paul Eastwick and Samantha Joel, and these are two social evolutionary psychologists who study physical attractiveness, they study romantic interest, they study relationship formations, and they're kind of veterans in that field. If you have read literature, a lot of literature on physical attractiveness, on mate selection, if you have read speed dating studies like I described, you probably have read some of the studies designed by these two individuals. So we're looking at research conducted by experienced researchers in this case. Some of these findings will replicate past findings by these researchers or by other researchers, and if they do, I'll try to mention that. This study was pre-registered, which is a good sign. Pre-registration, if you don't know what that is, it means that researchers are being encouraged now to state ahead of time what their hypotheses are and what methodology they will use to test those hypotheses. And this prevents a couple of bad research practices, or even cheating, you could say, in research, falsification of data. It means that because we know the hypotheses and the methods ahead of time, researchers can't go back and readjust the hypothesis to fit the data, which you might not think that is a problem, but the general consensus is that it is. You can't take your data and then see what the data supposedly says and try to redo your hypothesis. The scientific method, hypothesis formation, comes first. And so this is a way to keep researchers in check, to make sure that they are generating hypotheses that are sound and that their methods follow that. This also prevents things like p-hacking to some extent. Because this is such a large set of variables, they're using a machine learning approach which is specifically equipped to deal with large variables without inflating type 1 errors. And a type 1 error is when you reject the null hypothesis when it is true. If you use for example, a t-test with standard linear regression, and you have a lot of variables and you just keep testing a new variable over and over and over, and you have a cutoff, a p value cutoff of something like 0.05, which is very standard in this kind of research, you will eventually get a type 1 error. You will eventually reject the null when it is in fact true, simply because every time you run the test, there is that 5% chance. So you need a methodology that is equipped to deal with really large sets of variables, and this is what this accounts for here. Study demographics, I mentioned this, and let me be more specific. Almost everyone in this study is 18 years old, guys. This is a study of young students in college. So if you are 18, and I know a lot of the people attracted to this kind of information and these kind of channels are young men that want information on dating, this is going to be really, really relevant to you. Standard deviation was something like 0.2. So 18 and 19-year-olds is basically the entirety of this data set. If you are an older individual, if you are 30, then you have to wonder, how applicable is this going to be to your situation? Methods. So, as I said, this is a prospective study into the future, one of the first of its kind. So, what does that mean? It means that these individuals tracked who could potentially be a relationship in their lives into the future for a period of 7 months. So, every 3 weeks, everyone in this study would go back into the lab and they would answer a whole lot of questions, and one of those questions was, name 2 people that you are potentially interested in, rank them, and give us a measure of romantic interest on a 7-point scale, a 7-point Likert scale. 1, not interested; 7, super interested. You know, you've seen those sorts of things, something to that effect. Every 3 weeks they are doing this, and these are with acquaintances. These are with people that perhaps they know, and in fact we know from the descriptive statistics, I'll just go ahead and tell you now, about 70% of the people that would be included in these lists were acquaintances. They were people that were either friends, potential romantic acquaintances they said were not potential romantic interests, and so on. Again, every 3 weeks these people would go in and they would answer a bunch of questions. And these questions are your individual difference measures. Individual differences being your own personality traits, things like the Big 5 model of personality, things like attachment styles, secure attachment, avoidant attachment, anxious attachment. And in fact, they looked at 164 constructs. I think the actual variables were even much higher, but 164 individual difference constructs. So a huge range of constructs used in psychology that have been researched to predict some outcome related to relationships. Then, in addition to that, they also asked about target-dependent measures. And these are ratings for other targets. For the people they are saying, this is one of my potential targets, and this is one of my potential targets. The 2 people. And this is where you get things like physical attractiveness. Is the person confident? Is the person dominant? Is the person submissive? And we'll look actually at what those were specifically, or at least what the ones that came out that had an effect were, because most of these had no effect at all at the end of the day. But we're going to move on, and we're going to look at the results, and we're going to see which ones did in phase 2 of this study. But first, right now, we're going to look at phase 1 of this study, because 1 comes before 2. And phase 1 of this study is simply how romantic interest developed. What is the trajectory of romantic interest going from no relationship, acquaintance, person you've somehow known in some way, to, hey, we're in a relationship now. And I'm going to put a figure from the study on the board. This is figure 2 from the study. This figure shows over time the number of individuals reported as potential partners and relationship interest over time. And as you can see, over time, after about 3 weeks, relationship interest in individuals declined. And what this means, and we will see this later in the study, is that people are most interested in a relationship with an individual at the beginning of that relationship. And a little spoiler for the later results, at the beginning of a relationship is when people are most interested in that person over the course of the entire period. But, and I'm going to put figure 3 from this study on the screen now. This is a spaghetti plot. Romantic interest in the people who did eventually become romantic partners stayed much higher, which is a silver lining here. It is some optimism, some good news. People tended to stay interested in the people that they actually picked as potential partners, even if they didn't become actual partners, even if they were just potential partners. Two findings from the beginning. Relationship interest, really high at first. People are excited and interested in each other, and it declines. But if those people become partners or potential partners, it stays high. Okay. Here at this point, we can look at some descriptive statistics as well. I'll put figure 4 from this study on the board for you. And what we're asking here is who casually dated, who seriously dated, and who reported engaging in some kind of romantic contact or physical contact. And what I mean by that, the question in the study is essentially any physical romantic contact. So this included, for example, kissing. It would have included sex as well. We don't know, and we can't differentiate between the two here. And what we see in figure 4 is that about twice as many people reported romantic physical contact as they did dating. If you look at these two things, these charts, it may be a little confusing. You actually need to sum up the total for each chart if you want to see those totals, and that would be 67% of the participants reported romantic physical contact, while only 38% reported dating. So we're seeing that people are engaging in this romantic contact more than dating. But almost everyone who was chosen to date was pulled from that population, or excuse me, from that subpopulation of individuals who engaged in romantic physical contact, of partners who engaged in romantic physical contact. So what does this really describe? What does this mean? Well, most people are kissing, probably, their acquaintances and stuff like that before they start to date them. People could also be having hookups before those hookups develop. This is actually consistent with some of the research that is listed in this study as well, where about 15% of casual sex partners, hookups, move on to become actual relationships. And here we see about half of people engaging in physical romantic contact going on to become dates. Now, if you look at the total numbers of partners listed with physical romantic contact, it might seem very high. It's like 1,000 something. So you might see this and say, oh, this group of 200 kids has like 1,000 hookups now. But that's not the case, because of course, for one, we're talking about any physical romantic contact. So some of these people are just kissing and stuff like that. But aside from that, when we look at the statistics, 87% of our group of young people here had between 0 and 3 physical romantic contacts between that, in that 7-month period. The mean here is about 1.5. So actually, most of our young people only had one episode or one person with who they had romantic physical contact over a 7-month period. And I think this is consistent with data that I have run previously for the GSS in 2021, which showed most people are having sex in the context of a relationship between 85 and 95%. Here we kind of see the same thing, that about 87% of these people are having between 0 and 3 episodes of any romantic contact at all, including just kissing. So they're probably not being as promiscuous as is commonly perceived. And this is actually an effect that we see in research as well, is that people overestimate the promiscuity of others. It's an observed effect across multiple studies. It might be something to touch on at a later point in more detail. Now, I mentioned before that romantic interest in someone was basically highest at the beginning. And I'm going to put table 1 from the study on the table, and you can see that here. That initial and peak romantic interest was highly correlated, basically the same, and then it quickly drops off. For about 74% of participants, initial and peak romantic interest was in fact exactly the same. So that's when people are going to be most interested in a partner or a potential partner, is at the very beginning. And here we can also look at the individual difference variables, as I had mentioned previously, versus the target specific variables. Basically, what we're asking here is what matters more for relationship formation or romantic interest? Your own traits or the traits of the partner? Now, keep in mind here, these aren't different traits for both people. Everyone has this individual difference traits and these target-specific traits. But if you're looking at, it's essentially perception of others versus how they perceive you is another way to look at it. And what we see is that individual difference traits predicted romantic relationship formation or romantic interest much less. Rather, it was the target-specific reports that accounted for most of the variance. And actually, this is a replication of a previous finding by one of the study authors here, Samantha Joe. And that was that individual differences predicted about 19% of target-specific reports. Or excuse me, individual differences predicted about 19% of the variance. Target-specific differences or traits predicted about 45% of the variance. So, what has to do more with how romantic interest develops? Perhaps intuitively, I would say so for me at least, if you're attracted to someone or not, if you are interested in them or not, it has more to do with them than you. But, of course, that doesn't mean that's the only thing that is going to determine that. And here's where the study actually gets very interesting, and that's that neither individual differences nor target-specific differences were able to predict who was together after 7 months. The variance accounted for by this model by both individual differences and target-specific differences was only 6%. So even looking at all of these variables together as a model, they don't predict who stays together. They don't predict the outcome. You might think that some would, or that all of these together, since we're looking at all of these variables that contribute to relationship formation, would make a really good model, a really good predictor of who is together after 7 months, but they don't. And that's kind of the mystery in this study. And actually, I think we will touch more on that in phase 3 of this. So let's continue on now, because 2 follows 1, and we're going to go on now to the results section, phase 2. And this is which of the specific variables predicted romantic relationship and interest formation. As I said, we have our individual differences and target-specific differences. Let's go ahead and look at the individual difference measures first. And for that, I'll put figure 6 from the study up on the screen right now. Now, if you remember from the beginning of this study, 180 individual difference constructs, actual variables being measured even more. So these are all of the statistically significant ones. And as you can see, it's a really small group. And on top of that, these go in order of effect size. The highest effect size first in the list is sociosexuality. And I'm going to tell you the effect size guy, it's a 0.18. And that means that the effect was small. Or you could even say small, medium, maybe approaching medium, but basically a small effect. And that's the largest effect. I'm not going to tell you all of the effect sizes as they go down, because when you get to the smallest one on this list, even though it is statistically significant, it's 0. And as a side note, that's something I think that a lot of people don't understand when they read research, is that statistical significance is not a measure of effect size. You can have a result that is statistically significant and utterly meaningless because the effect is literally 0. Effect size is very important, and this is one of the reasons that we're seeing journals even begin to mandate now, especially in psychology and the social sciences, a report of effect size. Because effect size is what tells you, as the name implies, how big of an effect there really is. Statistical significance does not tell you something is significant in common parlance. It tells you that something has occurred, a result beyond chance given your data set and given the statistical methodology used. Small effect sizes across all of these, 0 for the smallest one. The largest one, sociosexuality. And actually, when they ran this, aside from machine learning, in a multivariate regression or a multi-level regression, the effect size would have decreased even a little bit more to 0.14. If you look at some of these others that are close to the top, for example, liberalism, the effect size is 0.03. Hedonism, it's 0.07. So, like I said, no reason to go down the list and look at all of these effect sizes, very small for individual difference measures. And what does that tell us? That these individual difference measures, as we saw from the previous model in the first phase of the study, have very little relevance as to who is forming romantic interest. As we saw in phase 1 of the study, on the other hand, the target-specific variables contributed more to the model, at least for the initial romantic interest and midpoint romantic interest. And I'm going to put figure 7 up onto the screen for you. And this will show you, similarly, the target-specific variables in order from largest effect size to smallest effect size. And here we're dealing with some effect sizes that are pretty good, especially the top one here, which is attractiveness, or the measure of physical attractiveness. And this is specifically, remember, every 3 weeks, these people picked 2 individuals who they were romantically interested in. They would have rated them according to these target-specific variables. And these target-specific variables, one of them would be physical attractiveness. How attractive is this person? Great. So here we are at figure 7. Physical attractiveness had the largest effect size at 0.57. Now 0.57 is huge in the social sciences, guys. Across other sciences you might call it a medium effect size. In social sciences I would call this a medium to large effect size, or even a large effect size. In the regression analysis this dropped down to 0.42, which is also pretty high. It's pretty rare to see effect sizes above 0.5 in psychology. And the reason for that is because individual variables don't predict most of human behavior. Human behavior is very, very complex. And that means that when you're correlating 2 variables, your effect sizes usually aren't going to be most of what predicts your dependent variable. With these, we can go down the list and look at the effect sizes a little bit more, because why not? At least these are worth mentioning, unlike the individual difference effect sizes, which were basically 0 apart from sociosexuality. And the second one we have on the list here is proximity seeking at 0.31, so a medium effect size. And what does proximity seeking mean? It means the desire to seek the other person out, to speak to them often. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing that our young people said other individuals were more likely to enter into relationships with them, that romantic interest would be higher if those individuals sought them out. Okay, so expressing interest, I guess here's some practical advice we can take from this. Expressing interest in someone, seeking them out, is probably going to be part of the picture here of getting into a relationship with them. Third on the list, we have perceived interest. And what does that mean? It means that the person is interested in you, or you think they are interested in you. And is this an intuitive one, guys, or is it counterintuitive? I think it could be interpreted either way. But what we see here is that thinking that the other person is interested in you is going to predict more relationship interest and relationship formation over time. Separation distress, as it sounds, effect size here, 0.27, so medium-ish effect size, is distress when you're not around that person, missing them, wanting to be with them more. Interestingly, next, with an effect size of 0.24, we see mixed signals. And apparently, people kind of like getting mixed signals. They predict more romantic interest over time in relationship formation. I would not have personally expected that, but there actually are relationship formation theories in psychology that do expect that, that state it outright, that mixed signals, the push and pull of it, is attractive. And I think in the manosphere, in dating communities for men and that sort of thing, as I just called this, push and pull, is sometimes advocated. Next on the list, exciting, effect size of 0.23. Okay, so they view their partner as an exciting person. Next on the list is secure base at effect size of 0.22. And this is basically what this measures. The question it asked is, if I achieve something good, this is the person that I would tell first. So it's kind of like your best friend or the person closest to you. Next on the list, prevention facilitation. Effect size 0.2 or 20%. This is the person that helps me feel it is my duty to be. So basically this is a person that prevents bad behavior or slacking. It's a person that holds you to a higher standard. Next on the list is self-disclosure, or 0.18. And this is basically a person that you feel comfortable opening up with. There are also relationship formation models in psychology that are based around self-disclosure, that say self-disclosure is how relationships form. People incrementally disclose more and more, little by little. So we see that this variable occurs. And remember, these target-specific constructs that they looked at, these variables are a part of those constructs. Those constructs were taken from psychological models on relationship formation. And what we see in this study is a small little bit of validation of those constructs and perhaps of those models. Next on the list is relative power, and here we have a negative 0.18. And what does that mean? It means they like partners that are less powerful. No one wants to feel like they are the one that has the least amount of power in a relationship. And so I think that would explain why not feeling like the person has power over you is more attractive. Next on the list is desirable alternatives. And this is the perception that someone has desirable alternatives to your current relationship. Basically that the person is desired, or that you are not their only option. Next on the list is confidence, 0.10. And here's where we're already starting to see the effect sizes get kind of small. 0.10, 0.1, 10%. So people say confidence, be confident. A confident person is very, very important. We don't see that confidence accounts for much of an effect here. And last on the list that I'll cover here at 0.09 or 9% is sexual contact. Have you engaged in any romantic physical contact with this person? And even that was not a strong predictor of romantic interest in the long term. It's already getting to a pretty small effect size here. Beyond that point, it's not really worth mentioning any others. Let's move on now to stage 3. And in stage 3, the researchers looked at what's called partner preference matching. And this is basically how closely were the partner's traits a match to what you wanted in the partner. Basically, do people pick actual partners that have the traits they say they want? You guys have heard the expression, perhaps, watch what women do, not what they say. That's kind of what we're looking at here. Do people really pick partners that have the traits that they say they want? Now, they probably asked this question because this is something that has been examined retrospectively in relationships. And a lot of the time, we don't see that people actually pick partners who have the traits they say they want in a partner. People are much, much more compromising on who they actually pick. So, what does this research show? Well, the answer is simply no. Let me put figure 9 up on the screen for you from the study. We see no main effect of partner matching. We see no slope. There's no curvilinear effect here. Traits did not predict partner selection more strongly in people who said that they preferred any trait. Let me put a figure 10 up on the screen for you here. Here you can go through each of these variables if you wish. They would be down at the bottom, the ones in bold. And you will see that the effect size of all of these matches, even at the moment, at initial attraction, over time, pretty much zero. And I say pretty much zero, I mean literally zero. These are effect sizes of nothing. And you can actually see a couple of these are statistically significant despite having effect sizes of 0. As I mentioned previously, statistical significance has no relevance in this case. And they also looked at a preference for the traits, because remember, some of these were rated on a Likert scale, and it didn't matter if the preference was strong or if the preference was weak. Even if people said they really, really wanted a trait, it didn't predict romantic interest in that person. It didn't predict short-term romantic interest. It didn't predict who would be in relationships at the end of 7 months. Now remember, I said all of these variables were taken from constructs that are intended to explain, or I should say models, constructs within models that are intended to explain relationship formation. Constructs, for example, such as warmth and trustworthiness, vitality, attractiveness, and that sort of thing. The authors took some of these constructs like warmth and attractiveness, vitality, attractiveness, warmth, trustworthiness, those specific variables, and ran. They found no effects. The constructs that we expected to predict relationship formation, romantic interest, didn't. They simply did not. Now, if you have read any research looking at ideal traits in relationships in the past, this might be kind of a surprising study to you, because when we look at past research that looks at ideal traits in partners who are picked, or I should say ideal traits in given relationships, we do see correlations. If you take a couple that has already been together for a period of time and you ask them to list their ideal traits in a partner, and then you ask them to list traits that correspond to that individual, or if you administer a test to that individual, a psychometric test, a questionnaire like a personality test that measures those actual traits, or even if it's a trait like physical attractiveness where you can measure through raters or what have you, there will be a correlation. In existing relationships, the traits that partners say that they like do correspond to the partners that they actually have. But here in this study, we see that the traits people say they want do not correspond to the relationships that actually form over time. So how do we reconcile that? Well, one explanation could be that people simply adjust their preferences when they get into a relationship. They get into a relationship with someone who is nothing like the person that they thought they were interested in. But now that they're in a relationship with that person, their mind switches a little bit, their preferences change a little bit, and when they're asked, like, hey, what kind of things do you like? They list things that are similar to the partner that they have selected. This is why this study is actually very important and new and interesting and different, because it looked at prospective partner choice, who actually picked someone into the future, and not retrospective partner choice. When we see correlations between people that say they like a trait and the partner they have, but it's a retrospective study, we don't know that they actually picked the partner because they had those traits. We can only know that with the kind of methodology used in this study. And what this study would indicate is that people don't pick partners based on those traits. Even if down the line they say, I like the kind of traits that my partner has, that might not have been why they picked that partner in the first place. And if we look at Table 7, which I'll put up on the screen for you right now, we actually see we have some of these small, medium-sized correlations between all of the ideal trait pairs in partners. And this actually replicates past research, which shows about the same effect sizes in these correlations between what people say they like in a partner and the traits that their actual partner has. So, as I mentioned, what might be going on here are what are called perceiver effects. After getting into a relationship, people perceive their partners as being more similar to those traits, or alternately, they change their own opinions and now they like the traits of their partner more. We can't know for sure from the methodology. The methodology tells us what happened. It doesn't always tell us why something happened. So the explanation here is open. But what we can say from this is that it doesn't seem like people are actually choosing their partners because of these traits. Let's move on close to the end, guys. Let's do a quick summary of what we've covered so far. Okay? So this is one of the first studies to have ever tracked how relationships form into the future, with a longitudinal perspective methodology. What we saw here was that physical attractiveness was the strongest single variable that would predict romantic interest and relationship formation. But only for that initial to mid point. When we look at who was still together after 7 months, physical attractiveness didn't tell us anything, and neither did any of the other variables in this entire study. We learned that romantic interest is highest when it is new, basically within the first 3 weeks of indicating romantic interest in a person. So perhaps we're looking at something here similar to the so-called honeymoon phase in folk wisdom, in pop psychology. People are most attracted to their partners when the relationship is new, and then it declines. Kind of intuitive here. I think that will make people. It's probably not as dire a finding as some people would think, but typically that could be a normal relationship outcome. We learned that target-specific traits were much more important than individual variables, individual difference variables in this study. People were more interested in what the other person was like, as opposed to having their own internal personality features, behaviors, dispositions predict their entry to a relationship. The one exception here that had any movement at all was the variable of sociosexuality. And what is that, guys? It's the willingness to have sex outside of a relationship. So people who are more open to having sex were more likely to form these romantic relationships, more likely to indicate romantic interest in a relationship. And we learned that what people say they want in a partner doesn't predict who they will actually be with in the long term. It doesn't predict romantic interest in an individual. What people do and what they say they want seem to be pretty disconnected in this study. So what can we learn from this study? When I reflect back on it, and when I originally read this study, I made a short about it and just kind of glossed over it, and went back and looked at it, and it was kind of complicated to read. I read it through many times, a very long study. And what really left an impression on me was the finding that over time, none of these variables predicted who would be together in 7 months. Not the most attractive person, not the most confident person, not the most dominant person, not the most compatible person, not the person that people said they wanted to be with. None of that mattered. None of it predicted relationship outcomes. And because that was the end of the methodology, we're left with, well, what does then? And this study doesn't tell us. The study doesn't tell us who stays together or why, because none of the variables came out. None of them predicted it. And I think that says something, I think it says something really important about the complexity of human relationship formation. After looking at these hundreds of variables, this 180 individual difference constructs and 30 target-specific constructs, all of these constructs that are related to psychological theories for relationship formations, and none of them predicted who would be together after 7 months. It's kind of a moment like, oh, I don't really know shit. And the study didn't really tell us shit, and none of the results came out. There's definitely a message here about nuance, about being humble about what you really know in this field, what you really know about relationships, and who will stay together. For a practical point of view, for dating and relationship advice, there's a lot of relationship and dating gurus that will tell you how to build a good marriage, a strong marriage, what you need to do, what kind of person you need to be, etc., etc. And we don't see that more confidence or more dominance or more assertiveness or even more physical attractiveness predicts who's going to be together after 7 months. So what is it all really based on? Well, this doesn't mean we can discount any of that just because it didn't detect an effect. But I think it does mean that we need to really approach this with caution and with nuance. I think there's also in this study a little shred of validation for the black pillars, that core nucleus of truth in the black pill, which is that physical attractiveness matters, because although physical attractiveness did not predict who would still be together after 7 months, it was a pretty strong variable, especially in the social sciences, in psychology, for predicting that initial romantic interest. And I think this is consistent with past research that we have seen, which shows that physical attractiveness functions as a gate, that people have to meet that looks test, so to speak. They have to hook the person with some kind of attractiveness. They have to be attractive enough, and then after that point, maybe attractiveness doesn't matter anymore. Maybe it doesn't contribute very much to who stays together, and maybe all of these other variables can then come into play at that point. But at the beginning, at least, it's important for initial romantic interest. From the descriptive statistics, we learn that relationship formation is also kind of rare. Only 38% of our study dated in that 7 months, and only 11% of that would go on to become a serious relationship at the end of 7 months. So there was a lot of physical contact, there was some dating, but serious relationships emerging out of all of that were kind of rare. And this is pretty consistent with past research on relationship formation. Again, as I have mentioned, there is little. The same author of this study, Paul Eastwick, who has designed a lot of speed dating studies, found that in an interaction with 10 to 12 people in a speed dating study, there was maybe a 5% chance of getting picked, which means that in these speed dating studies, the ability that someone will actually go on to date a stranger that they met is only about 1%. In fact, it's lower than 1%. So imagine you go on a speed dating study and you have a sample size of 40, and they go in a circle. The probability that one of those guys or girls is going to date a partner coming out of that, less than 1%. And I think that's not entirely counterintuitive. It might seem worse if you think like, oh, I'm deliberately trying to date all of these people. But if you think about the people you interact with on a day-to-day basis, how many of those people became romantic relationships? How many people in your class became romantic relationships? In real life, the way we approach people is probably pretty rare. I don't approach 1% of women on the street. I'm not attracted to, more than 1% of people if I see them walking down the street. So perhaps if you create that kind of environment where people go in a circle, it's normal that only 1% or so of relationships emerge from that. And if you look at people over a period of time interacting with all of these potential partners, perhaps it's normal that maybe only 10% of those are actually in relationships at a relatively short period at the end of 7 months. And looking at the development or the trajectory of romantic interest, looking back on that, what we see is that it just declines. Now, past models and measures of romantic interest in relationships have shown kind of a curvilinear relationship where relationship interest is very high at the beginning, then it declines, and then it peaks again, perhaps as people become more committed. We don't see that in this study. We see that relationship starts high and it declines. A limitation here might be that it was only 7 months, but as there are really no other studies looking into the future with a similar methodology, we can't say like, oh, it was only 7 months and that's why. We don't have anything else to compare it to. So that could just be the reality of it, that everyone is excited at first, time goes on, and they're a little bit less excited. And guys, I think we are finally at the end of this thing. So I hope you learned a lot from this. I hope you were all able to follow along fairly well with the charts and with the results. If not, if you have questions, please leave a comment. If you would like clarification on anything, leave a comment. And if you like the video, if you want more videos like this, like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll try to keep coming out with these these breakdowns of relevant research into dating, into attraction, and into all of the things that I hope you guys are interested in. So I look forward to it, and I'll talk to you guys next time.